You know those moments in life where you think you're being a decent human being, maybe even a borderline saint, and then the universe just laughs in your face and says, "Hold my beer, watch this." Yeah, well, buckle up because I'm about to tell you about the time I learned that no good deed goes unpunished, especially when it involves family, a spare bedroom, and the kind of optimism that should probably be classified as a mental disorder. It all started on a Tuesday evening, which should have been my first red flag because nothing good ever happens on a Tuesday. Mondays get all the hate, but Tuesdays? They're the sneaky little troublemakers of the week, sliding in under the radar while you're still recovering from the Monday blues. I was sprawled on my couch, feet up, remote in hand, living my best life watching some mindless show about people buying houses they definitely can't afford, when my wife Clara walked in with that look on her face. You know the one I'm talking about, that peculiar expression that's half smile, half. I'm about to ask you something you're not going to like, but I'm going to make it sound reasonable. Married folks will know exactly what I mean. It's the same look that precedes conversations about visiting in-laws, adopting another pet, or in this case, housing displaced relatives. "Hey babe," she started, sitting down next to me with the kind of calculated casualness that immediately put me on edge. "So, I was talking to my mom today, and you know how Brandon's been having a rough time lately?" I nodded slowly, my spidey senses tingling like crazy. Brandon was Clara's younger brother, a guy who somehow managed to turn every job opportunity into a temporary gig and every temporary gig into an unemployment saga. The last I'd heard, he was working at some tech startup that sold artisanal USB cables or something equally ridiculous. "Well," Clara continued, reaching over to grab my hand in that way that's supposed to be comforting but really just means she's locking me in for the conversation. "He lost his job last week, and things are pretty tight for him and Lydia right now. Now, let me tell you about Brandon's employment history real quick because it's important context for understanding the spectacular disaster that was about to unfold. This dude had worked at a gym, fired for accidentally canceling a rival's membership, a coffee shop, let go after his experimental latte art somehow involved drawing inappropriate images in foam, and most recently, that tech company I mentioned. The official story was that he'd been laid off due to company restructuring. But Clara's mom had let it slip during Sunday dinner that there'd been an unfortunate misunderstanding involving the company fridge, someone's clearly labeled Greek yogurt, and Brandon's apparent belief that office supplies were communal property. Apparently, Brandon had been taking this poor guy's yogurt for weeks, and when confronted, he'd launched into some bizarre philosophical debate about shared resources and capitalism. Security had been called. It was a whole thing. "Okay," I said carefully, already sensing where this conversation was heading like a freight train with no brakes. "That's rough. What's he gonna do?" Clara squeezed my hand tighter, and I swear I could hear the traps snapping shut in real time. "Well, that's the thing. He and Lydia are having trouble making rent, and we thought, maybe they could stay with us for a little while, just until Brandon gets back on his feet." She said it so hopefully, with those big eyes that had convinced me to marry her in the first place, and honestly, what was I supposed to say? "No, let your brother become homeless." That would make me the villain in every future family gathering until the end of time. I looked around our house, doing some quick mental calculations. We had a spare bedroom that we'd been using as a combination home office slash storage room slash dumping ground for stuff we didn't know what to do with. It had a bed in there somewhere under the pile of old college textbooks and used exercise equipment and about 17 Amazon boxes I kept meaning to break down. We had a fully stocked fridge because I'd just done a Costco run and was feeling particularly accomplished about my meal prep situation. We had peace and quiet, a functioning household, and a dog named Rufus who had finally stopped chewing on furniture. In my mind, I was thinking maybe 2 weeks, 3 tops. Brandon would fire off some resumes, land something decent because the job market was supposedly great, and they'd be out before I even noticed they were there. "Sure," I said, and I swear I heard ominous thunder in the distance even though it was a perfectly clear evening. What's the worst that could happen? They can take the spare room, we'll help them out, and they'll be back on their feet in no time. Clara's face lit up like I'd just told her we'd won the lottery, and she threw her arms around me, calling me the best husband ever, the most understanding brother-in-law, basically nominating me for sainthood right there on the couch. I felt pretty good about myself, not gonna lie. Look at me, being all mature and supportive, opening my home to family in need. I was basically the protagonist in one of those heartwarming family movies where everything works out and everyone learns valuable lessons about love and togetherness. Spoiler alert, I was wrong. So spectacularly, hilariously, pull your hair out wrong that if my life were a movie, this would be the moment where the audience yells at the screen, "Don't do it, you idiot." I was about to learn that "just for a while" is the most dangerous phrase in the English language, right up there with "trust me" and "what could go wrong." I was about to discover that having a spare room doesn't mean you're obligated to fill it with chaos, and that a stocked fridge is basically an open invitation for freeloaders to treat your home like an all-inclusive resort. But standing there in my living room, hugging my wife, feeling like the hero of my own story, I had absolutely no idea what I'd just signed up for. I thought I was being the bigger person, rising above, doing the right thing. Turns out, being the bigger person just means you're a bigger target. And boy, was I about to get hit. Moving day arrived on a Saturday morning, which should have been my sacred time to sleep in until at least 9, make pancakes, and pretend I had my life together. Instead, I was up at 7 because Brandon had texted me at 6:30 saying they'd be there bright and early with their stuff. When I stumbled downstairs in my ratty pajama pants and a t-shirt that said, "I'm not arguing, I'm just explaining why I'm right," I found them already parked in my driveway with a U-Haul that looked way too big for people who were supposedly just staying a little while. Lydia was the first one out of the truck, and let me tell you, this woman stepped out like she was arriving at a red carpet event. Designer sunglasses, perfectly styled hair, outfit that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and she was carrying one of those small dogs that looks perpetually angry at the world. I didn't even know they had a dog. Nobody had mentioned a dog. The little furball took one look at me and started yapping like it had personal beef with my existence. "Oh, don't mind Precious," Lydia said, air kissing both my cheeks like we were in some European film. "She's just protective of mommy." I looked at Clara, who was standing next to me with coffee mugs for our guests, and she just shrugged with this "I didn't know either" expression. Great. Fantastic. We were now a multi-dog household, and one of those dogs was named Precious and had a better wardrobe than I did. Brandon came around from the driver's side, and I noticed he'd grown out this weird little goatee situation that made him look like he was auditioning for a nu metal band from 2002. "Bro," he shouted, way too loud for 7:30 in the morning, pulling me into one of those aggressive bro hugs that's more about demonstrating dominance than actual affection. "Thanks so much for this, man. You're literally saving our lives right now." The first week, I'll admit, wasn't terrible. It was almost pleasant, like the pilot episode of a sitcom where they're establishing all the characters and everyone's quirky but lovable. Lydia actually cooked dinner a couple times, and while her organic quinoa surprise tasted like punishment for sins I hadn't committed yet, the effort was appreciated. Brandon helped me move some boxes in the garage and only complained about his back 3 times, which for Brandon was practically heroic. They'd join us for movie nights on the couch, and Lydia would make these elaborate charcuterie boards that she'd photograph for 45 minutes before anyone was allowed to touch them. She called me Big Brother, which was weird but kind of endearing in a "I'm trying really hard to be part of this family" way. Brandon even made good on his promise to fix the dripping tap in the guest bathroom. Well, he tried to fix it. He spent about 4 hours down there with YouTube tutorials playing on his phone, various wrenches spread across the floor, and a growing pile of random pipe parts that I was pretty sure weren't supposed to come off. When he finally emerged, sweaty and defeated, he announced that the tap just needed to settle, and that the dripping would probably stop on its own eventually. Spoiler alert, it's still dripping. I've started calling it the soundtrack to my regret. But then, right around day 8, things started to shift. Subtle at first, like when you first notice a weird sound in your car and you try to convince yourself it's nothing. I came home from work on a Wednesday to find that my living room had undergone a transformation. The coffee table, which usually held Clara's design magazines and a tasteful succulent that somehow stayed alive despite my best efforts to kill it, was now buried under Brandon's laptop, a tangle of charging cables, printed resumes, energy drink cans, and, I kid you not, a 3-ring binder labeled Brandon's Career Comeback, The Journey. My couch, my beautiful sectional that I'd spent 3 months researching and comparing prices for, had become his throne. There was an actual butt print permanently indented in the cushion. "Hey man," Brandon said when I walked in, not even looking up from his screen. "Just setting up my job search command center. Gotta be strategic about this, you know? Can't just apply to anything. Gotta curate the right opportunities." I peeked over his shoulder at his laptop screen, expecting to see Indeed or LinkedIn or literally any job site. Nope. FIFA 23. He was in the middle of an online tournament, yelling at someone through his headset about formations and substitutions. "Just taking a quick mental break," he explained, somehow sensing my skepticism without turning around. "You can't job hunt effectively when you're stressed. It's about balance, bro. Balance." Right. Over the next few days, I started noticing that Brandon's quick mental breaks lasted approximately 6 to 8 hours daily, with actual job searching squeezed into maybe 30-minute windows between matches. He'd set up this whole elaborate station with his gaming chair. Yes, he'd brought a gaming chair that he somehow fit in the U-Haul, dual monitors, and a mini fridge that he'd positioned next to the couch for optimal efficiency. My living room had become a teenage gamer's basement, except the teenager was a 31-year-old married man living rent-free in my house. Meanwhile, Lydia had made some interesting discoveries about herself. Apparently, she suffered from a severe allergy to cleaning products, which she announced one evening when Clara gently suggested maybe helping out with dishes. "Oh, I wish I could," Lydia said, placing her hand dramatically over her chest like she was auditioning for a Victorian fainting scene. "But my doctor says I have a sensitivity to chemicals. Dish soap, laundry detergent, all-purpose cleaner, they all trigger my condition." I asked what condition that was exactly, and she said something vague about environmental sensitivities while scrolling through Instagram on her phone. Funny how her allergies didn't prevent her from using my expensive hair products in the shower or spraying her perfume that could probably be classified as a chemical weapon. The bathroom situation deserves its own paragraph. We have 2 bathrooms in our house, the master attached to our bedroom and the guest bathroom that Brandon and Lydia were supposed to use. Except Lydia had decided that the guest bathroom didn't have the right energy for her morning routine, which apparently required at least 90 minutes and involved more products than a Sephora store. She'd started using our bathroom while Clara and I were at work, and I only discovered this when I came home for lunch one day and found her in there, face mask on, cucumbers on her eyes, sitting on my toilet like it was a spa chair. She didn't even seem embarrassed, just waved at me and said, "Almost done, big brother." My snacks started disappearing at an alarming rate. I'm talking about my private stash, the good stuff I kept hidden in the back of the pantry behind the quinoa that nobody ever touched. My artisanal beef jerky? Gone. The expensive dark chocolate I'd been rationing? Vanished. The family-size bag of Cool Ranch Doritos I'd been looking forward to all week? Nothing but crumbs and a note that said, "I owe you, Brandon," with a smiley face. Even Rufus, my supposedly loyal dog who I'd raised from a puppy, had betrayed me. I'd find him in their room all the time, curled up on their bed like he'd forgotten who actually fed him and paid his vet bills. And the thermostat. Oh man, the thermostat became a full-on battlefield. I like my house at a reasonable 68 degrees. It's comfortable, it's economical, it's the temperature that human beings evolved to survive in. But apparently, Lydia needed it at 76 degrees minimum because anything lower gave her cold-induced anxiety. I'd come home and immediately start sweating, walk over to the thermostat, and find it cranked up like we were trying to recreate the Sahara Desert. I'd turn it down, and within an hour, it would be back up. This happened so many times that I started to suspect the thermostat itself had switched allegiances. Through all of this, I kept my mouth shut. I smiled. I nodded. I told myself that I was being the supportive brother-in-law, the understanding host, the bigger person. When Clara would ask how things were going, I'd say fine through gritted teeth. When my buddy Mike came over and asked why my living room looked like a GameStop had exploded, I made excuses about Brandon needing space to focus. I was determined to be patient, to be kind, to not be that guy who complains about helping family. But somewhere deep inside, in that part of your brain that keeps track of grievances and starts mental lists of passive-aggressive comments, I was beginning to realize that just for a while was looking more and more like indefinitely. And my patience, which I'd thought was pretty substantial, was starting to wear thinner than Brandon's job search efforts. 2 weeks into this arrangement, and I was starting to feel like a prisoner of war in my own home. Except instead of actual combat, I was engaged in psychological warfare involving household appliances and personal boundaries. You know that feeling when you wake up in your own bed, but something feels fundamentally wrong, like you've entered an alternate dimension where everything looks the same but operates under completely different rules? Yeah, that was my life now. It started with my coffee machine. Not just any coffee machine, mind you, but my beautiful, glorious, top-of-the-line espresso maker that I'd saved up for and purchased after months of research and YouTube tutorials on becoming a home barista. This thing was my pride and joy, my morning ritual, my reason for getting out of bed on Mondays. I'd even named her Stella. Don't judge me. Everyone has their thing, and Stella was mine. So you can imagine my absolute horror when I stumbled into the kitchen one morning, bleary-eyed and desperate for caffeine, only to find an empty space where Stella used to live. I stood there for a solid 30 seconds, convinced I was still asleep and having some kind of anxiety nightmare. But nope, I was fully awake, and my coffee machine had genuinely vanished. I checked the counter, the pantry, even the dishwasher like maybe I'd had some kind of fugue state, and put it away in a completely illogical place. Nothing. I was about to file a missing appliance report when Lydia breezed into the kitchen wearing one of those matching athleisure sets that cost more than my first car. "Morning, big brother," she chirped, way too cheerful for someone who was about to explain Grand Theft Espresso. "Oh, you looking for the coffee thingy?" "Yeah, we borrowed it for our room. Brandon and I are starting a couple's morning routine TikTok series, Wake Up and Slay with the Johnsons. The aesthetic in our room is just perfect for it, very Scandinavian minimalist vibes. Your kitchen is a bit too, lived in." Lived in. She called my kitchen lived in, which apparently was TikTok speak for not aesthetically pleasing enough for my social media empire. I asked when I might get Stella back, and Lydia just laughed and said, "Oh, we're shooting content all week. Don't worry, we'll take super good care of her." That was it. That was the moment I realized I'd lost control of my own house. My coffee machine was now a prop in someone else's content creation dreams, and I was supposed to just smile and use the backup Mr. Coffee that I'd kept from my college days, which made coffee that tasted like regret and broken dreams. I texted my buddy Mike about it, and he just sent back 3 crying laughing emojis, and bro, you got played. Thanks, Mike. Real supportive. The snack situation had escalated from annoying to genuinely concerning. I'd started hiding food like I was preparing for the apocalypse, stashing granola bars in my sock drawer, keeping a secret candy supply in my car, and even putting decoy snacks in the pantry while keeping the good stuff in a locked toolbox in the garage. Yes, a locked toolbox. I had become that person. And still, somehow, Brandon found everything. I swear this dude had some kind of snack-seeking superpower, like a bloodhound, but for Cheez-Its and trail mix. I'd find empty wrappers in the weirdest places, between couch cushions, in the bathroom trash, once even in the garage behind the lawnmower. It was like living with a very large, very entitled raccoon. One particularly low moment came when I discovered he'd eaten my emergency stash of Girl Scout cookies that I'd been rationing since March. Thin Mints, the good ones, the ones you can only get once a year. I'd been saving them for a special occasion, or at least a really bad day, and this joker had demolished all 3 sleeves in one sitting. When I confronted him about it, he looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "Bro, they were in the freezer. I thought they were communal." Communal. Like we were living in some kind of socialist collective where private property didn't exist and everything belonged to everyone. I told him that unless he'd been contributing to the grocery budget, which he hadn't, nothing in this house was communal except maybe the air. And even that was negotiable. Rufus, my allegedly loyal dog, had completely switched teams. I'd find him in Brandon and Lydia's room constantly, sprawled on their bed like he paid rent there. The worst part was that he'd started ignoring me when I called him. Me, the guy who'd potty trained him, who'd rushed him to the emergency vet when he ate a sock, who'd spent countless hours teaching him tricks that he never actually learned. Now he'd look at me with these dismissive eyes like I was a stranger asking for spare change, then trot off to Brandon's room where apparently they'd been giving him table scraps and letting him watch TV with them. I'd been replaced in my own dog's affections by a guy who couldn't hold down a job and thought FIFA counted as networking. Speaking of Brandon's networking, I'd started to notice a pattern in his daily routine. Every morning around 10, after he'd finally rolled out of bed and claimed my spot on the couch, he'd open his laptop with this serious, determined expression like he was about to hack into the Pentagon. He'd crack his knuckles, take a deep breath, and then spend the next 4 hours scrolling through Twitter and Reddit, occasionally posting memes about unemployment with captions like, "The struggle is real face with steam from nose," and "Job market got me like Skulda." That was his networking. That was his hustle. He'd even added digital content creator to his LinkedIn profile, which as far as I could tell meant he shared other people's memes and commented "same bro" on posts about hating Mondays. I tried talking to Clara about it one evening after work. We were in our bedroom, the only place I felt like I could speak freely without being overheard, and I laid out my concerns as diplomatically as possible. "Babe," I said, choosing my words carefully like I was defusing a bomb. "I'm starting to feel like a guest in my own home. My stuff keeps disappearing, my space keeps getting invaded, and I'm pretty sure Brandon hasn't actually applied to a real job yet." Clara looked up from her phone, where she'd been scrolling through her own feed, and gave me this look. The look that wives give husbands when they think they're being dramatic. "You're exaggerating," she said, patting my hand like I was a child complaining about vegetables. "They're family. They're going through a rough time. Brandon is trying. He's just adjusting to unemployment. It's hard for him." I wanted to ask what exactly was hard about playing video games and eating my snacks all day, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I brought up the coffee machine situation, the thermostat wars, the fact that I'd found Lydia wearing my favorite vintage concert t-shirt yesterday while doing yoga in the living room. Clara just laughed it off, said I was being territorial, that sharing was part of hosting family. The thermostat thing had become an actual war of attrition. I'd installed an app on my phone that controlled it remotely, thinking I was being clever. I'd be at work, see it jump to 77 degrees, and immediately adjust it back down to 68. Within minutes, it would be back up. We'd go back and forth like this all day, this silent battle of wills conducted through smart home technology. I half expected to come home one day and find Lydia had just ripped the thermostat off the wall and replaced it with one I couldn't access. The electric bill for that month was going to be absolutely criminal, and I knew exactly who wouldn't be contributing to paying it. The final straw of the week came on Friday evening. I'd had a particularly brutal day at work. My boss had given me feedback that was basically, "You're doing great, but here's 17 things to improve." I'd spilled coffee on my shirt during a presentation, and I'd sat in traffic for an hour because of some accident on the interstate. All I wanted was to come home, change into comfortable clothes, and decompress. Instead, I walked into my house to find Lydia lounging on my couch, wearing my college hoodie, the one from my alma mater that I'd had for 15 years, watching some reality show about people getting plastic surgery and screaming at each other. She had her feet up on my coffee table, toenails freshly painted, Precious the demon dog curled up in her lap. "Hey, big brother," she said, not even glancing away from the TV. "Hope you don't mind. I borrowed your hoodie. Mine are all in the wash, and this one looked so comfy." Meanwhile, Brandon was in my recliner, the one I'd specifically bought for my back problems, controller in hand, yelling at someone on his headset about their defensive strategy. My house had been completely colonized, and I was just standing there in the doorway like a visitor who'd shown up to the wrong address. That night, lying in bed while Clara slept peacefully next to me, I stared at the ceiling and tried to calculate how much longer I could maintain my sanity. 2 weeks had felt like 2 months. Just for a while, was starting to look like a life sentence. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear Brandon's gaming session still going strong at midnight, mixed with the sound of my coffee machine gurgling away in their room, probably making espresso for their stupid TikTok video. I tried to be patient. I tried to be the supportive brother-in-law. But patience, I was learning, had a limit, and mine was running out faster than the snacks in my pantry. Monday morning started like any other terrible Monday, except somehow worse because I'd spent the entire weekend watching Brandon and Lydia treat my house like their personal resort. I'd gotten up extra early, determined to reclaim some semblance of control over my life by getting to work before the chaos could fully unfold. I made my sad Mr. Coffee brew. Because Stella was still being held hostage for content creation, grabbed my laptop bag, and headed toward my home office to print out some reports I needed for a morning meeting. That's when I discovered that someone had declared war on my last remaining sanctuary. I opened the door to my office and literally froze mid-step, coffee mug halfway to my lips, brain trying to process what my eyes were seeing. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and something is so fundamentally wrong that your mind goes into denial mode? Like maybe you're hallucinating or you've accidentally entered a parallel universe. That was me, standing in the doorway of what used to be my organized, functional workspace, now transformed into something that looked like a yoga studio had a baby with a feng shui Pinterest board. Everything, and I mean everything, was different. My desk, which I'd positioned specifically by the window for natural light and a view of the backyard, had been moved to the opposite wall. My ergonomic office chair, the one I'd spent $300 on after my chiropractor said I was destroying my spine with poor posture, was gone. In its place sat a giant purple beanbag chair that looked like it belonged in a teenager's basement. My carefully organized filing system, color-coded labels, alphabetized folders, the whole 9 yards, had vanished. The shelves where I kept my reference books and work binders were now decorated with crystals, burning sage that made the whole room smell like someone was trying to summon a spirit, and a small Buddha statue that I was pretty sure was judging me. What the hell? I said out loud to absolutely no one, walking further into the room like I was investigating a crime scene. My diplomas, which had been hanging on the wall in nice frames, were now stacked in a corner behind the door. In their place were motivational posters with phrases like "manifest your destiny" and "good vibes only" in that annoying cursive font that screams, "I bought this at Target." My laptop dock was missing. My wireless keyboard, nowhere to be found. Even my favorite pen, the nice one I'd gotten as a work anniversary gift, had disappeared into whatever organizational black hole had consumed the rest of my stuff. I stood there for a solid minute, trying to decide if I was more angry or impressed by the sheer audacity. Then I heard footsteps behind me, and Lydia appeared in the doorway wearing a silk robe and holding a green smoothie, looking pleased with herself like she'd just renovated a condemned building instead of destroying my workspace. "Oh, good. You found it," she exclaimed, beaming at me like she expected a thank you. I did a complete energy cleanse of this space over the weekend. The vibes in here were so stagnant, big brother. All that paperwork and those harsh fluorescent desk lamps. It was blocking the natural flow of abundance. Now doesn't it feel so much more open and welcoming? She gestured around the room like she was hosting an HGTV show. I moved everything that was creating negative energy into the garage. "Don't worry, I was super careful with your papers. They're all in a box somewhere." Somewhere. My organized files, which contained important work documents, tax records, and client information, were now in a box somewhere in my garage, which currently housed about 40 other boxes, lawn equipment, and probably some spiders that had been living there since we moved in. I asked her, with what I thought was remarkable restraint given the circumstances, where exactly my chair had gone. She took a sip of her smoothie and said, "Oh, that old thing? It was really killing the aesthetic, so I put it in the basement. But trust me, the beanbag is way better for your chakras. Regular chairs create tension in your root chakra, which explains why you've been so uptight lately." Uptight. I'd been uptight. Not stressed because my home had been invaded, not frustrated because my belongings kept disappearing, not annoyed because someone had just demolished 3 months of filing work. No, it was a chakra problem. Obviously. I wanted to ask if there was a chakra specifically responsible for not strangling your house guests, but I figured that wouldn't be productive. Instead, I asked, trying to keep my voice level, if maybe she could have asked before completely rearranging my workspace. You know, like a normal person who respects boundaries and other people's property. Lydia looked genuinely confused, like the concept of asking permission was a foreign language she'd never encountered. "But I was trying to help," she said, her voice taking on that wounded tone that people use when they want to make you feel bad for being reasonably upset. "Clara mentioned you'd been stressed about work, and I thought improving your office energy would be a nice surprise. I even used my own sage. Do you know how expensive organic white sage is?" I didn't know, and I didn't care. What I did know was that I had a meeting in 45 minutes. My reports were in a mystery box in the garage, and I was about to lose my mind in my own house. I spent the next 20 minutes frantically searching through boxes in the garage, getting progressively sweatier and angrier, finally finding my files in a box labeled "Negative Energy Papers" in Lydia's loopy handwriting. I was late to my meeting, showed up disheveled and flustered, and spent the whole time thinking about how I was going to handle this situation without causing World War III in my marriage. When I got home that evening, I'd had 8 hours to rehearse what I was going to say to Brandon. I decided to approach it diplomatically, brother-in-law to brother-in-law, man to man. Just have a calm conversation about boundaries and mutual respect. I found him in his usual spot on my couch, controller in hand, looking like he hadn't moved since I'd left for work. Perfect. Hey, Brandon. I started, sitting down on the arm of the couch since all the actual seating was occupied by him and his gaming setup. Can we talk for a minute? He held up one finger in that universal wait gesture, eyes glued to the screen, muttering something about needing to finish this match. I waited and waited. 5 minutes later, when his match finally ended in what I gathered was a devastating loss based on his creative cursing, he finally looked at me. I explained, as calmly as I could, that Lydia had rearranged my office without asking, and maybe we needed to establish some ground rules about personal spaces and belongings. Before I could even finish, Brandon cut me off with this patronizing smile like I was a child complaining about bedtime. Dude, Lydia was just trying to help. She's really into that wellness stuff, you know? She's actually studying to be a life coach. This was news to me. Besides, he continued, leaning back and stretching, you've been looking pretty stressed lately. Maybe you should take her advice. Then, and this is the part that really got me, he started giving me financial advice. Brandon, the guy who hadn't paid for groceries once, who'd been unemployed for almost a month, who'd eaten approximately $400 worth of my food and hadn't contributed a single cent to any household expense. This guy looked me dead in the eye and said, you know, bro, you'd probably save a lot of money if you canceled your gym membership. I noticed you're still going like 3 times a week. That's probably what, 50, 60 bucks a month? That's almost $700 a year you're just throwing away. You could work out at home for free. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for the moment where he'd laugh and say he was kidding. But no, he was serious. Dead serious. He even pulled out his phone and started showing me some budget app he'd downloaded, gesturing at charts and graphs about my theoretical finances like he was some kind of financial guru instead of a grown man playing video games in someone else's living room. I've been doing a lot of research on personal finance lately, he said, scrolling through articles he'd apparently bookmarked. It's all about cutting unnecessary expenses and maximizing value. Like, do you really need premium cable? Or that expensive coffee machine? The coffee machine that was currently in his room. The one he and Lydia were using daily for their TikTok empire. I excused myself before I said something I'd regret, went upstairs, and found Clara in our bedroom folding laundry. She looked so peaceful, so content, completely unaware that I was about 2 seconds away from listing the spare room on Airbnb with current tenants still in it. I sat down on the bed and tried to explain everything. The office situation, Brandon's unsolicited financial advice, the fact that I was starting to feel like a guest in my own home, or worse, like an annoying roommate who actually paid bills and owned property. Clara listened, but I could see it in her eyes before she even spoke. She didn't get it. Babe, she said, setting down the shirt she was folding and putting her hand on my knee. I think you're overreacting a little bit. Yes, Lydia should have asked before moving your stuff, and I'll talk to her about that. But she was trying to do something nice. And Brandon's just trying to be helpful with the financial advice. He's probably feeling bad about being here without contributing. So this is his way of trying to help. I pointed out that actual help would be getting a job, or at least applying to jobs, or maybe not eating everything in the pantry like a very large locust. Clara laughed, actually laughed, and said, you're being dramatic. They're family. They're going through a rough patch. We have the space. We have the resources. Why wouldn't we help? I wanted to list about 17 reasons why, starting with because my coffee machine has been kidnapped and ending with because I found Brandon using my expensive shaving cream yesterday. But I could see this conversation wasn't going anywhere productive. Just give it a little more time, Clara said, going back to her laundry. They'll get back on their feet soon, and everything will go back to normal. You're just stressed from work. Maybe you should try that beanbag chair. It might actually help. That night, lying in bed, I realized something important. Nobody else saw the problem because nobody else was dealing with it the way I was. To Clara, this was family helping family. To Brandon and Lydia, this was just how things worked when you stayed with relatives. But to me, this was my home being slowly colonized, my space being invaded, my patience being tested in ways I didn't know were possible. And the worst part was that I was supposed to just smile and take it, because apparently setting boundaries with family made you the bad guy. I fell asleep that night to the sound of Brandon's gaming session and the smell of Lydia's sage burning somewhere in the house, wondering how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine. 3.5 weeks into this living arrangement that was supposed to last just a little while, I developed some interesting coping mechanisms. I started leaving for work earlier just to avoid morning interactions. I'd begun eating lunch in my car like some kind of suburban hermit. I even joined a book club at the local library on Thursday nights, not because I particularly wanted to discuss literary themes with strangers, but because it gave me a legitimate excuse to be out of my own house. My buddy Mike had started calling me the lodger because apparently I'd become a guest in my own home. Haha, very funny, Mike. So when I came home on a Wednesday afternoon, I'd left work early because I had a dentist appointment that got canceled. I definitely wasn't expecting to find Lydia sitting at my dining room table with a folder, a notepad, and an expression that can only be described as, "We need to have a serious talk about your life choices." She'd actually set up the scene like she was conducting a performance review, complete with 2 chairs facing each other and a glass of water positioned at each seat. There was even a small potted plant in the center of the table that I'd never seen before, probably there for positive energy or whatever her latest wellness kick was about. "Oh, perfect. You're home early," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her like this was her house, and I was the one who needed permission to sit down. "We need to have a family discussion. It's important. Can you sit?" The way she said it wasn't really a question. It was one of those statements disguised as a question that people use when they're about to tell you something you're not going to like, but they want to pretend you have a choice in the matter. I looked around for Brandon, figuring if this was a family discussion, he should probably be involved, but he was nowhere to be seen. I could hear the faint sound of gunfire and explosions coming from the living room, which meant he was deep into his daily gaming session and probably wouldn't surface for air for another 3 hours. Lydia caught my glance and waved her hand dismissively. "Brandon's busy with his networking. This is more of a household management conversation anyway. He asked me to handle it." Household management. Those 2 words should have been my warning sign, my red flag, my signal to turn around and walk right back out the door. But like an idiot, I sat down, took a sip of the water she'd poured for me, and waited to hear whatever fresh nonsense was about to come out of her mouth. I was thinking maybe she wanted to talk about chore schedules or grocery shopping, or perhaps, in a moment of self-awareness, apologize for the office incident. How naive I was. How beautifully, tragically naive. Lydia folded her hands on the table in front of her, took a deep breath like she was about to deliver news about a terminal diagnosis, and gave me this look that was trying to be sympathetic but came off more condescending. You know that expression people make when they're about to tell you something for your own good? That was it. She opened her folder, an actual manila folder with tabs and everything, and pulled out what looked like a printed spreadsheet. "So," she began, her voice taking on this therapist-like quality that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Brandon and I have been here for almost a month now, and we've been doing some calculations about the household expenses and overall financial situation." She slid the spreadsheet across the table toward me, and I could see it was covered in numbers, percentages, and highlighted sections. "We wanted to make sure everything is fair and equitable for everyone involved." I picked up the paper, squinting at her handwriting and the various categories she'd created. There were sections for utilities, internet, groceries, shared living space maintenance, and something labeled emotional labor and household coordination. I had no idea what that last one meant, but it had a dollar amount next to it that made my eye twitch. "Okay," I said slowly, still not sure where this was going, but getting a bad feeling in my gut. "What exactly are we talking about here?" Lydia smiled, the kind of smile that people use in customer service when they're about to deny your refund request but want to seem pleasant about it. "Well, we need to discuss rent." She let that word hang in the air for a moment, watching my face for a reaction. I gave her nothing, mostly because my brain was still trying to process what she'd just said. Rent. She wanted to discuss rent. Was she finally going to offer to pay rent? Was this the moment where they acknowledged that living somewhere for free for almost a month was maybe not the most sustainable arrangement? "What rent?" I asked, setting down the spreadsheet and leaning back in my chair. I was genuinely curious now, wondering if maybe I'd misjudged them, if perhaps they'd been saving up and were about to surprise me with a contribution to household expenses. Maybe all my frustration had been premature. Maybe they were actually responsible adults who just needed a little time to get their finances together. Lydia's smile got wider, which should have been my second warning sign. Well, since Brandon's brother owns the house, she started, but I cut her off immediately because I needed to correct this misunderstanding right away before it went any further down whatever weird rabbit hole she was heading toward. I'm Brandon's brother, I interrupted, pointing at myself for emphasis. I'm his brother-in-law, technically, since I'm married to his sister. And I own this house. Just me. Not we. Not the family. Just me and Clara. I said this slowly and clearly, like I was explaining something to someone who was still learning English, because clearly there had been some massive miscommunication somewhere along the way. But Lydia didn't look surprised or embarrassed. She just nodded patiently, like I was a student who'd given an incorrect answer, but she appreciated my effort. Right, exactly, she said, pointing at me like I'd just proven her point. You're Brandon's brother-in-law, and Brandon co-owns the property with you as a family investment. That's why we think it's only fair that you start paying your share of the expenses. I'm not ashamed to admit that I laughed. I laughed so hard that I almost fell out of my chair, tears streaming down my face, clutching my stomach like I'd just heard the funniest joke in human history. It was the kind of laugh that starts genuine and then becomes slightly hysterical when you realize the person telling the joke is actually serious. Lydia sat there watching me with this confused expression, clearly not understanding what was so funny, which somehow made it even funnier. Oh man, I gasped, wiping my eyes and trying to catch my breath. That's a good one. Brandon co-owns the house. That's hilarious. Did he tell you that? Because wow, that's creative. I'll give him points for creativity. But as I looked at Lydia's face, watching her expression shift from confused to defensive, I realized with growing horror that she wasn't joking. She actually believed this. She genuinely, truly believed that Brandon owned half of my house. This isn't funny, Lydia said, her voice getting colder. Brandon told me when we first got married that he'd invested in this property with you. He said it was a family thing, that you'd both put money in and both owned it. He showed me papers and everything. Papers? What papers? The mortgage was in my name. The deed was in my name and Clara's name. Brandon had never given me a single dollar toward this house. Not for the down payment, not for the mortgage, not for the property taxes, not for anything. I took a deep breath, trying to shift from laughing to being serious, because I needed to handle this delicately. Lydia wasn't the problem here. She was just incredibly misinformed by her husband, who apparently had been spinning some elaborate fantasy story about his real estate empire. Lydia, I said, keeping my voice calm and even, I don't know what Brandon told you, but he doesn't own any part of this house. Clara and I bought this house 5 years ago. We saved up for the down payment. We applied for the mortgage. We signed the checks every month. Brandon has never contributed anything financially to this property. She was shaking her head before I even finished, pulling out more papers from her folder. No, that's not right. Look, I have the agreement right here. Brandon showed me this when we were dating. She slid across what looked like a printout of some document, and as I picked it up and started reading, I realized it was completely fabricated. It was supposedly a co-ownership agreement between Brandon and me, dated from 5 years ago, outlining how we'd purchased the property together as an investment. The formatting was all wrong. There were spelling errors, and most tellingly, the signature that was supposed to be mine looked nothing like my actual signature. This is fake, I said, probably more bluntly than I should have. This document doesn't exist. I never signed this. Brandon made this up. I watched Lydia's face go through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, denial, anger, and then something that looked like the beginning of understanding. Look, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but your husband has been lying to you. He doesn't own anything. He's unemployed, living in my spare room rent-free, and apparently creating fake legal documents to impress his wife. Lydia grabbed the paperback, staring at it like if she looked hard enough, it would suddenly become real. Her hands were shaking slightly, and I almost felt bad for her. Almost. She'd been living in my house for almost a month, rearranging my office, using my stuff, and apparently planning to charge me rent in my own home, all based on her husband's delusions of property ownership. But he showed me his bank statements, she said quietly, more to herself than to me. He said the mortgage payments came out of his account. What account? I asked. Brandon doesn't have any money. How could he be paying a mortgage? The pieces were starting to come together in my head, and none of them were painting a good picture. How deep did this lie go? What else had Brandon told his wife? Did she think he was secretly wealthy? Did she think they were just temporarily down on their luck before returning to their mansion? Lydia stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. She gathered up all her papers, shoving them back into the folder with shaking hands. I need some air, she muttered, her face pale. I need to think about this. I need to. She didn't finish the sentence, just turned and walked quickly toward the spare room, leaving me sitting alone at the dining room table with her elaborate rent spreadsheet and a whole new appreciation for just how complicated this situation had become. I sat there for a long time, listening to muffled voices coming from the spare room. Lydia's rising in pitch, Brandon's trying to explain something, and wondered how we'd gotten here. How had my simple act of kindness, my sure they can stay for a while, turned into fake ownership documents and rent negotiations? I picked up Lydia's spreadsheet again and noticed she'd calculated that I owed them approximately $800 for my share of living in my own house for the past month. Yeah, this was going to end well. The muffled argument coming from the spare room lasted about 20 minutes, with Lydia's voice getting progressively higher and Brandon's getting progressively more defensive. I could hear phrases like, "You told me," and "It's not that simple," and at one point, what sounded like something being thrown against a wall. I stayed at the dining room table, still holding that ridiculous fake ownership document, trying to figure out how someone could be so delusional that they'd create an entire alternate reality and expect it to hold up under scrutiny. Clara came home right in the middle of the chaos, walking through the door with grocery bags and immediately sensing that something was very wrong. She looked at me sitting at the table, looked toward the spare room where the argument was still raging, and said, "What did I miss?" with the weary tone of someone who'd been expecting something like this to happen eventually. I handed her the fake document and Lydia's rent spreadsheet without saying a word. Sometimes you don't need commentary. The evidence speaks for itself. I watched Clara's eyes move across the papers, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that looked like anger mixed with embarrassment. "He told her he owns our house?" she asked quietly, looking up at me. "He told his wife that he co-owns our house and showed her fake documents." I nodded, and she sat down heavily in the chair Lydia had vacated, still staring at the papers like they might suddenly make sense if she looked at them long enough. "It gets better," I said, pulling over Lydia's spreadsheet. She was planning to charge me rent, $800 a month for the privilege of living in my own home. There's even a breakdown of how she calculated it. Apparently, I use more hot water than them, so I should pay a larger percentage of utilities. Clara actually laughed at that, a short, sharp sound that was more shock than humor. "My brother," she said slowly, "created fake legal documents, convinced his wife he's a property investor, and then his wife tried to charge my husband rent in our own house. Did I get all that right?" Before I could answer, the spare room door flew open and Lydia emerged dragging a suitcase behind her face blotchy and makeup smeared from crying. She looked at both of us sitting there, seemed like she was about to say something, then just shook her head and continued toward the front door. Brandon came rushing out behind her, still in his gaming headset which he'd apparently forgotten he was wearing, looking panicked in a way I'd never seen before. "Lydia, babe, wait," he called out, doing this awkward shuffle run to catch up with her. "Let me explain. It's not what you think. I can explain everything." Lydia whirled around, and I'm not exaggerating when I say I'd never seen someone look so angry while simultaneously looking so hurt. "Explain what, Brandon?" she shouted, loud enough that I was pretty sure our neighbors could hear. "Explain how you've been lying to me for 2 years? Explain how you made me look like an idiot trying to charge your brother-in-law rent in his own house? Explain how every single thing you've told me about your financial situation has been complete bullshit." Clara and I just sat there, frozen, watching this soap opera unfold in our entryway. It was like a car crash, horrible but impossible to look away from. Brandon was doing this thing where he kept reaching for Lydia but not quite touching her, his hands hovering in the air uselessly. "I was going to tell you," he said, which has to be in the top 5 worst possible responses to "you've been lying to me." Things got complicated, and I didn't know how to. Complicated. Lydia cut him off, her voice rising even higher. What's complicated about the truth, Brandon? Were you ever going to tell me that you don't actually own property? That you're not actually a successful investor? That we're not temporarily between places, but actually homeless and living off your sister's charity? She started counting on her fingers, tears streaming down her face. The condo in Miami that you said we'd visit doesn't exist. The rental properties generating passive income don't exist. The family investment portfolio doesn't exist. What else, Brandon? What else have you been lying about? Brandon's face had gone completely white, and he kept glancing at me and Clara like we might jump in and help him out. Fat chance, buddy. This was his mess, and honestly, I was kind of enjoying watching it implode. Was that petty of me? Absolutely. Did I care? Not even a little bit. This dude had been living in my house rent-free, eating my food, using my stuff, giving me unsolicited financial advice, and apparently telling his wife that I was the freeloader in this scenario. He could handle his own relationship drama. The bank statements, Lydia continued, pulling out her phone and scrolling frantically. You showed me bank statements with mortgage payments going out. Where did those come from? Did you fake those too? Brandon looked down at his feet, which was answer enough. Oh my God, Lydia breathed, and I could see the full weight of everything hitting her at once. Everything. You faked everything. The investment statements, the property documents, the bank records, all of it was fake. Clara finally spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. Lydia, I'm so sorry you're finding out like this. But you should know that Brandon has never owned any property. He's never invested in anything with us. He lost his job a month ago, and we offered to let you both stay here temporarily while he got back on his feet. That's it. That's the whole story. Lydia nodded slowly, processing this information, then turned back to Brandon with this look that could have melted steel. I asked you specifically before we got married, she said, her voice now eerily calm, which somehow seemed worse than the yelling. I asked you if you were financially stable. You showed me papers, statements, proof of assets. You convinced my parents you were a good provider. My dad gave us money for our investment opportunities that you said you were managing. Where did that money go, Brandon? Oh man, this was getting deeper by the second. Brandon had apparently run some kind of long con on his wife and her family, complete with forged documents and fake financial statements. This wasn't just a little white lie that had gotten out of hand. This was full-scale fraud. It was for us, Brandon stammered, finally finding his voice. I was going to turn it around, make real investments. I just needed time to. Lydia held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Don't. Just don't. I can't even look at you right now. She grabbed her second suitcase that she'd apparently dragged into the hallway and headed for the door again. Brandon tried to follow, but she turned around with such force that he actually took a step back. I'm going to my sister's place in Portland, Lydia said, her voice shaking but determined. Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't contact me at all until I figure out if our marriage is even real or if that was fake too. She looked over at me and Clara, and some of the anger drained from her face, replaced by embarrassment. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I'm so sorry for everything. The office, the rent thing, all of it. I genuinely thought. Her voice cracked, and she took a breath. I genuinely thought I was helping to manage our family property. I feel like such an idiot. You're not an idiot, Clara said, standing up and walking over to her. You were lied to. That's not your fault. Lydia gave her a watery smile, then looked at me. Can I just say, for the record, that trying to charge you rent in your own house is probably the most embarrassing thing I've ever done? If we ever laugh about this someday, please know that I will never, ever recover from the humiliation. Despite everything, I found myself smiling. At least Lydia had the self-awareness to recognize how absurd the situation was. Water under the bridge, I said. Go take care of yourself. And maybe change your bank passwords or something. She actually laughed at that, a sad little sound, then wheeled her suitcases out to her car. We watched through the window as she loaded them into her trunk, got in, and drove away without looking back. Brandon stood in the doorway staring after her, still wearing his gaming headset like the world's saddest streamer. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Precious the demon dog yapping from somewhere in the spare room. Finally, Brandon turned around to face us, and I got ready for what I assumed would be either an apology or an explanation. Instead, he pointed at me with this accusatory finger and said, Bro, You ruined my marriage. I blinked, genuinely wondering if I'd heard him correctly. I'm sorry, what? I said. I ruined your marriage? Not the lying, the fraud, the fake documents, or the systematic deception of your wife for 2 years, but me telling her the truth. You didn't have to tell her like that, Brandon said, his voice rising. You could have talked to me first, let me explain it to her my way. But no, you just had to blow everything up and make me look like a liar. The irony of that statement was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Buddy, I said, standing up and walking toward him slowly like I was approaching a wild animal. I hate to break it to you, but you are a liar. You didn't need my help to look like one. You did that all by yourself with your fake documents and imaginary real estate empire. Brandon's face turned red, and he started ranting about respect and betrayal and how family is supposed to have your back even when you're wrong. Which, let me tell you, is a fascinating perspective from someone who'd been living rent-free in my house while telling his wife I was the one freeloading. I let him get it all out. Something about brotherhood and loyalty and how I'd never understand because I'd never struggled like he had, before I finally held up my hand to stop him. You're right, I said calmly. I haven't struggled the way you have. You know why? Because I don't lie to people. I don't create fake documents. I don't scam my in-laws. And I don't blame other people when my own choices blow up in my face. Brandon opened his mouth to argue, but I wasn't done. You've been here almost a month. In that time, you've eaten my food, used my stuff, rearranged my office, and apparently told your wife an elaborate fiction about owning my house. And now you're mad at me? Are you serious right now? That's when Clara walked in from wherever she'd disappeared to during the first part of this conversation, probably giving us space to have it out. And she had that look on her face that meant she was done with. Everyone's nonsense. Brandon, she said, her voice carrying that older sister authority that made him automatically straighten up, you need to leave. Brandon stared at Clara like she'd just suggested he jump off a cliff without a parachute. Leave, he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Clara, come on. I'm your brother. You're really going to kick me out over this. Clara crossed her arms, and I recognized that stance. It was her, I've made a decision and nothing you say is going to change my mind position. I'd seen it exactly 3 times in our marriage, and each time, I'd been smart enough to just accept whatever she'd decided and move on with my life. You lied to your wife for 2 years, Clara said, her voice steady but cold in a way I'd rarely heard. You created fake documents with my husband's name on them. You've been living in our house, eating our food, using our things, and apparently planning to charge us rent in our own home. So yes, Brandon, I'm telling you that you need to leave. Brandon's face went through this whole journey of emotions, shock, anger, defiance, and then this desperate pleading look that might have worked on our parents but wasn't going to fly with Clara. I don't have anywhere to go, he said, and there was a whine in his voice that made him sound about 12 years old. Lydia just left me. I don't have money for a hotel. What am I supposed to do? Sleep in my car? I almost said, yes, but managed to bite my tongue because Clara was handling this and I didn't need to pile on. Almost. The thing was, Brandon had a point about not having anywhere to go, but that wasn't really our problem anymore, was it? He'd created this situation with his lies and his laziness and his complete inability to function like a responsible adult. You can stay tonight, Clara said, and I must have made some kind of noise because she shot me a look that clearly said, don't argue with me right now. Just tonight. Tomorrow morning, you pack your things and you figure something out. Call mom and dad. Call your friends. I don't care. But you can't stay here anymore. Brandon nodded slowly, looking like a kid who'd just been grounded, and for a moment I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Then I remembered the fake documents, the rent scheme, the month of living rent-free while giving me financial advice, and my sympathy evaporated faster than water on hot pavement. Fine, Brandon muttered, turning to head back toward the spare room. Thanks for nothing, sis. Real nice family support. That comment made Clara's jaw tighten, but she didn't respond. She just watched him walk away, then turned to me and let out this long, exhausted sigh. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I'm so sorry about all of this. You were right. I should have listened when you said things were getting out of hand. I pulled her into a hug because honestly, what else was I supposed to do? This wasn't her fault. She'd just been trying to help her brother, and he'd turned it into a circus. We thought that was the end of it for the night. We figured Brandon would sulk in his room, maybe pack some stuff, and we'd deal with the final departure drama in the morning when everyone had calmed down. We were wrong. So magnificently wrong. About an hour later, while Clara and I were in the kitchen trying to salvage some kind of normal evening by making dinner, stress cooking is a real thing, and apparently we both do it. We heard Brandon's voice getting progressively louder in the living room. He was on the phone with someone, probably one of his friends, giving them his version of events. And let me tell you, his version was creative. Yeah, man, my sister and her husband just kicked me out for no reason, he was saying, his voice carrying into the kitchen. I've been helping them with their property management, trying to teach them about finances, and this is how they repay me. Some people are just ungrateful, you know? I looked at Clara, Clara looked at me, and we had this silent conversation that only married people can have where you communicate entire paragraphs with just facial expressions. Should I? I started, but Clara shook her head. Let it go, she said. He's leaving tomorrow. It doesn't matter what he tells his friends. She was right, of course, but it still irritated me that he was out there rewriting history like he was some kind of wronged hero instead of the architect of his own downfall. I went back to chopping vegetables with maybe a little more force than necessary, taking out my frustration on an innocent bell pepper. Then we heard a crash. Not a loud crash, but the distinct sound of something hitting a wall, followed by Brandon shouting, "This is such bullshit." Clara and I both rushed into the living room to find Brandon standing there, his gaming controller on the floor where he'd apparently thrown it, his face red and blotchy, looking like he was about 2 seconds away from a full meltdown. The controller had left a small dent in the drywall, which was just perfect. Another thing to add to the list of damages. Everything okay in here? I asked, using that carefully neutral tone you use when you know everything is definitely not okay, but you're trying to de-escalate. Brandon whirled around to face me, and I noticed he was still wearing that ridiculous gaming headset, which somehow made the whole scene even more pathetic. Here was a 31-year-old man, unemployed, recently separated from his wife, standing in his brother-in-law's living room in a gaming headset, having what could only be described as a tantrum. "No, everything is not okay," he shouted, grabbing the controller off the floor and holding it in this weird aggressive way, like it was a weapon he might use to defend himself. "You've ruined my life. My wife left me, my sister is kicking me out, and for what? For telling the truth about our property arrangement? For trying to make things fair. Our property arrangement." He was still sticking to this story, still living in this alternate reality where he owned half my house. It was almost impressive, really, the commitment to the delusion. "Brandon," I said, trying to remain calm even though I wanted to grab that controller and throw it out the window. "There is no our property arrangement. This is my house. Mine and Clara's. You don't own any part of it. You never did. And you didn't tell the truth. You've been lying to your wife for 2 years about being a property investor." I took a step toward him, and he actually raised the controller higher, like he was preparing for battle. "If you don't stop yelling and put down the controller, I'm going to start charging you late fees for every day you've existed in my kitchen without paying rent." That probably wasn't the most helpful thing to say, but I was done being diplomatic. I was done being understanding. This dude had pushed every boundary, taken advantage of every kindness, and was now trying to play the victim like he was the injured party in all this. Brandon's face got even redder, if that was possible, and he started pacing back and forth, still clutching that controller, muttering to himself about respect and family and how nobody understood him. Clara stepped in, trying to mediate. "Brandon, let's all just calm down and—" But he cut her off, spinning to face her with this wild look in his eyes. "Calm down? You want me to calm down? My marriage is over. I don't have a job. I don't have anywhere to live, and you're telling me to calm down?" He turned back to me, pointing the controller at me like it was a sword. "This is all your fault. If you'd just backed me up with Lydia, if you'd just gone along with it, everything would have been fine. Gone along with it." He wanted me to lie to his wife, to support his fraud, to help him maintain this elaborate fiction he'd created. The audacity was actually breathtaking. "You want me to commit fraud?" I asked incredulously. "That's your solution?" I should have just nodded along while you tried to charge me rent in my own house. Brandon opened his mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. "And let's be clear about something. Your marriage isn't over because of me. It's over because you're a liar. You lied to your wife about your finances, your assets, your entire life situation. That's on you, buddy. Not me. You don't understand what it's like. Brandon shouted, and I could see tears starting to form in his eyes. You've always had everything together. Good job, nice house, perfect wife. You don't know what it's like to struggle, to feel like you're not good enough. I held up my hand, stopping him mid-rant. Don't even start with that. You think I didn't work for what I have? You think this house just fell into my lap? I worked my ass off, saved money, made responsible decisions. And you know what I didn't do? I didn't lie to people. I didn't create fake documents. I didn't mooch off my relatives while simultaneously looking down on them. Brandon's face crumpled, and for a second I thought he might actually cry. Instead, he screamed, "You're heartless," at the top of his lungs, loud enough that I was certain the neighbors were getting quite the show. The words echoed in the living room, and I just stood there, looking at this man-child who thought that everyone else was the problem, that the world was just being unfair to him, that he had no responsibility for the disaster his life had become. "No," I said quietly, my voice steady and calm in contrast to his screaming. "I'm not heartless. I'm just a landlord who's been unpaid since day one. And you know what? I'm tired of it. I'm tired of you eating my food, using my stuff, disrupting my life, and then having the audacity to act like I'm the bad guy here." I walked over and picked up the controller from where he dropped it again during his rant. "You threw this at my wall. It left a mark. You're going to fix that before you leave tomorrow." Brandon just stared at me, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, clearly trying to think of something to say that would make him sound like the victim here. Before he could formulate whatever nonsense he was cooking up, Clara stepped between us. "That's enough," she said firmly. "Both of you. Brandon, go to your room. We'll deal with everything tomorrow morning." She said, "your room," with emphasis, reminding him that it was temporary, that it had always been temporary, and that temporary was now over. Brandon looked like he wanted to argue more, but something in Clara's expression must have gotten through to him, because he just nodded and shuffled off toward the spare room, still muttering under his breath about how unfair everything was. We heard the door close, and then blessed silence fell over the house. Clara and I stood there in the living room, looking at the dent in the wall, the scattered gaming equipment, the general chaos that had been my life for the past month. "Well," I said finally, "that was lively." Clara started laughing, that slightly hysterical laughter that comes after intense stress when your brain doesn't know how else to process what just happened. I joined in, and we stood there giggling like idiots in our war zone of a living room. "Tomorrow morning," Clara said between laughs, "he's gone. I promise. No matter what sob story he tells, no matter what excuses he makes, he's out of here." I pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I'm holding you to that." We never did finish making dinner that night. We ordered pizza, ate it in our bedroom with the door locked like we were hiding from a monster, and tried to pretend that the next morning's departure was going to be smooth and drama-free. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. I woke up the next morning with this weird feeling in my chest that I eventually identified as hope mixed with dread. Hope that Brandon would actually leave without additional drama, and dread because I knew better than to expect things to go smoothly when Brandon was involved. It was barely 6:30, way too early for a Saturday, but I couldn't sleep anymore. I kept imagining all the ways the morning could go wrong, like my brain was playing out disaster scenarios on a loop. Brandon refusing to leave. Brandon guilt-tripping Clara. Brandon setting something on fire. Okay, that last one was probably unlikely, but at this point, nothing would surprise me. I found Clara already up, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, staring at the wall with this 1,000-yard stare that I'd only seen a few times in our marriage. "Couldn't sleep either?" I asked, pouring myself a cup from the pot she'd made. She shook her head. "I kept having this dream where Brandon refused to leave, and we had to get the police involved. And then my parents showed up and blamed me for ruining the family. And somehow it ended with me crying in a Costco parking lot." I sat down next to her and squeezed her hand. "Well, the good news is that even if the police and your parents do show up, at least we can avoid the Costco parking lot part. We had a plan, or at least the skeleton of a plan. We'd give Brandon until 9 to wake up on his own, and if he wasn't up by then, we'd wake him. We'd give him two clear options: apologize for everything, the lying, the freeloading, the property fraud, the controller throwing incident, and commit to actually job hunting and helping around the house if he wanted to stay temporarily, or pack his stuff and leave by noon. Clara said it had to be a real apology too, not one of Brandon's specialty. I'm sorry you feel that way non-apologies that he was famous for. At 8:15, we heard movement from the spare room. I'd mentally prepared myself for a showdown. Maybe some more yelling, definitely some guilt tripping. What I wasn't prepared for was Brandon emerging from the room fully dressed, dragging 2 suitcases behind him, looking like he'd been awake for hours. He had bags under his eyes. His hair was sticking up in weird directions, and he was wearing this expression that I can only describe as defeated but still somehow annoyed about it. "Morning," he muttered, not making eye contact with either of us. He wheeled the suitcases into the living room and went back for more. Clara and I exchanged glances, both of us clearly thinking the same thing. Was he actually leaving without a fight? Had a miracle occurred? Was this actually going to be easy? I should have known better than to jinx it with optimistic thoughts. That's like the cardinal rule of dealing with difficult people. Never assume it's going to be easy until they're actually gone. Brandon made 3 more trips, bringing out boxes, garbage bags stuffed with clothes, his gaming equipment carefully packed like it was made of precious gems, and finally, Precious the demon dog in her designer carrier, yapping her tiny head off at 6 in the morning. By the time he'd assembled everything in our living room, it looked like a yard sale had exploded. I hadn't realized they'd accumulated so much stuff in just a month. Where did it all come from? Had they been secretly shopping online with money they didn't have? "So," Brandon said finally, standing in the middle of his pile of belongings, "I guess this is it." He still wasn't looking at us directly, focusing instead on adjusting the strap on one of his duffel bags. "I just want you both to know that I think you're making a huge mistake. Family is supposed to stick together, especially during hard times. But I guess some people value property more than blood." And there it was, the guilt trip I'd been expecting. The attempt to make us feel like the bad guys for not wanting to house a lying, freeloading, property fraud committing adult child indefinitely. Clara stood up, and I could see her sister mode activating, that particular blend of love and frustration that only siblings can achieve. "Brandon," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "you lied to your wife for 2 years. You created fake documents with our names on them. You've been living here rent-free while planning to charge us rent in our own house. This isn't about valuing property over blood. This is about you facing the consequences of your own actions." Brandon finally looked up at her, and for a second, I thought maybe he'd have a moment of clarity, maybe realize that this entire situation was his own doing. Instead, he said, "You wouldn't understand. You've never had to struggle like I have." I actually laughed out loud at that, couldn't help myself. "Dude," I said, standing up and walking over to where he was surrounded by his worldly possessions. "Clara and I both worked full-time while going to college. We lived in a studio apartment the size of this living room for 3 years while we saved for a down payment on this house. We ate ramen and generic cereal. We drove cars that barely ran. Don't talk to us about struggle when your version of struggling is playing FIFA for 8 hours a day in someone else's house." Brandon's jaw clenched, and I could see him trying to formulate some kind of comeback, some way to spin this so he was still the victim. Before he could, there was a knock at the door. We all froze, looking at each other like we'd been caught doing something illegal. Who the hell was knocking on our door at 8:30 on a Saturday morning? I walked over and opened it to find a woman I'd never seen before, probably in her late 50s, wearing a tracksuit and holding a casserole dish. "Hi," she said brightly, pushing past me into the house like she'd been invited. "I'm Sandra from 2 doors down. I heard there was some excitement here last night. The walls are thin, you know, and I wanted to make sure everything was okay. I brought a breakfast casserole." She looked around the living room, taking in Brandon, the mountain of luggage, Clara's exhausted face, and seemed to immediately understand the situation. "Oh, moving day? How exciting. Where are you off to, young man?" Brandon looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. I'm, uh, I'm still figuring that out," he mumbled. Sandra's smile got even wider, which I didn't think was possible. "Oh, you're one of those. My nephew was like that too, just figuring things out for about 6 years. He lived with me and my husband until Carl finally had enough and changed the locks one day while he was out." She said this cheerfully, like it was a fond memory. "Best thing we ever did. He got a job within a week. Funny how that works." I decided I liked Sandra. She set the casserole down on the coffee table and turned to Clara. "You're being very generous, dear, but don't let him guilt you. Family is important, but so is not enabling grown men to act like teenagers. She patted Brandon on the shoulder in this condescending way that made him wince. You'll be fine, sweetie. Everyone grows up eventually. Some just take longer than others. With that, she gave us all a little wave and let herself out, leaving behind the casserole and an incredibly awkward silence. Well, I said finally, that was something. Brandon had gone from looking defeated to looking absolutely mortified, which honestly made my morning. Nothing says rock bottom quite like being lectured by a stranger about your life choices while standing in a pile of your own stuff at 8:30 in the morning. He started loading things into his car without another word, making multiple trips back and forth while Clara and I watched from the doorway, making sure he actually took everything. The process took about 45 minutes, during which Brandon didn't say a single word to either of us. He loaded his car with an efficiency I'd never seen from him before, probably motivated by sheer embarrassment and the desire to get out of there as quickly as possible. When he came back for his final load, the gaming setup, naturally, I couldn't resist offering to help. Not because I was feeling generous, but because I wanted to make absolutely sure he took it all with him. We carried his dual monitors out to the car in silence, packed them carefully in the back seat, and then stood there in the driveway in that awkward way people do when they know they should say something but don't know what. Brandon finally broke the silence. I guess this is goodbye then, he said, still not quite meeting my eyes. Yeah, I replied, because what else was I supposed to say? Have a nice life? Good luck with the whole pathological lying thing? Hope you figure your shit out eventually? Brandon opened his mouth like he might apologize or explain or justify, but then seemed to think better of it and just closed it again. He walked around to the driver's side, paused with his hand on the door handle, and looked back at me. For a second, I thought maybe he'd finally have that moment of realization, that breakthrough where he acknowledged his role in this disaster. Instead, he muttered, "You know, some people would have been more supportive. Some people understand what family means." And that's when my last shred of patience evaporated. I'd been trying to be civil, to let him leave with some dignity intact, to be the bigger person one last time. But that comment, that little parting shot trying to make me feel guilty for not enabling his dysfunction, was too much. I walked over to his car, smiled my sweetest, most sarcastic smile, and said, "Hey Brandon, before you go, don't forget your dignity. It's under the couch next to your empty snack wrappers." His face went red, and he looked like he wanted to say something back, but what could he say? We both knew I was right. He got in his car, slammed the door harder than necessary, and peeled out of the driveway with more speed than was probably safe for a residential neighborhood. I stood there watching him go, feeling this weird mix of relief and exhaustion and satisfaction. He was gone. Actually gone. The nightmare was over. Clara came out and stood next to me, and we both watched Brandon's car disappear around the corner. "Did you really tell him his dignity was under the couch?" she asked, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I really did," I confirmed. "Too much." She shook her head. "No, I think it was exactly the right amount. Come on, let's go eat Sandra's mysterious casserole and reclaim our house." We walked back inside, and I swear the house already felt lighter, like a curse had been lifted. The first thing I did after Brandon's car disappeared around the corner was walk through every room of my house like I was touring a property I was thinking about buying. I opened doors, looked in closets, checked under beds, partly to make sure he hadn't left anything behind that would give him an excuse to come back, and partly just to reclaim my space. It felt like performing some kind of cleansing ritual, except instead of burning sage like Lydia would have done, I was just breathing in the sweet smell of freedom and checking for forgotten gaming equipment. The spare room was actually in better shape than I'd expected, probably because Lydia had done most of the packing before her dramatic exit. The bed was unmade. There were a few charging cables left behind, and someone had left half a protein shake on the nightstand that had started to separate in truly disgusting ways. But overall, it wasn't the disaster zone I'd feared. Clara and I spent the afternoon doing a deep clean, washing sheets, vacuuming, opening windows to air out the lingering smell of Brandon's Axe body spray and Lydia's essential oils. It was therapeutic, honestly, like we were erasing the last month and starting fresh. That first week after Brandon left was genuinely blissful. I can't even fully describe how good it felt to wake up on Sunday morning, walk into my kitchen, and find my coffee machine, Stella, returned from her TikTok captivity, sitting in her rightful place on the counter. I made myself a perfect cappuccino, walked into the living room, and sat in my own spot on the couch without having to navigate around gaming equipment or ask permission to watch what I wanted. No FIFA matches, no reality TV, no Precious the Demon dog yapping at shadows. Just peaceful, glorious silence. I could use my own bathroom without worrying about walking in on someone's 90-minute spa routine. I could open the pantry and find my snacks exactly where I'd left them, uneaten and unmolested. The thermostat stayed at 68 degrees, like God intended. Rufus, my turncoat dog, seemed confused for the first few days, wandering around looking for his new best friends, but eventually remembered that I was the one who actually fed him and paid for his veterinary care. He started sleeping in our room again, which felt like a small victory. I even reclaimed my office, though that took a bit more work. I had to move all the furniture back, reorganize my filing system from the negative energy papers box, and remove about 17 crystals and motivational posters. I found my ergonomic chair in the basement exactly where Lydia said it would be, covered in dust, but otherwise unharmed. The beanbag chair got donated to Goodwill, where I hoped it would bring someone else joy or at least better chakra alignment. By the end of the week, my office looked like my office again, and I'd never been so happy to sit at a desk and do boring work tasks. But while my house had returned to peaceful normalcy, Brandon apparently hadn't gotten the memo about accepting consequences and moving on with his life. The phone call started on day 2. Clara's phone would ring. She'd look at the screen, sigh deeply, and either answer or send it to voicemail, depending on her mood and energy levels. When she did answer, I could hear Brandon's voice through the phone even from across the room, loud, aggrieved, and convinced that the entire world was conspiring against him. "He wants to come over and talk," Clara said after one particularly long call on Tuesday evening. We were sitting on the couch watching some cooking show, enjoying the simple pleasure of controlling our own TV, when Brandon had called for the 3rd time that day. He says he's been doing some reflecting and wants to apologize in person. I raised an eyebrow at that. Reflecting was Brandon speak for sitting around feeling sorry for myself and deciding it's everyone else's fault. I asked Clara what she'd told him, and she said she'd politely declined and suggested he focus on finding a job and a place to live instead of worrying about apologies. The calls kept coming though, each one with a slightly different angle. Sometimes Brandon was apologetic, claiming he understood why we'd been upset and promising he'd learned his lesson. Other times he was defensive, insisting that we'd overreacted and that families were supposed to forgive each other. And sometimes, these were my favorite calls, he was just bewildered, genuinely confused about why his life had fallen apart and seeming to have no concept of his own role in the disaster. On Wednesday night, after Brandon's 4th call of the day, I was making dinner while Clara sat at the kitchen island looking exhausted from playing therapist to her brother. "He says you destroyed his life," she said, somewhere between frustrated and amused. "He keeps saying that if you just supported him with Lydia, everything would have worked out fine." I looked up from the vegetables I was chopping, considering my response carefully. "Tell him," I said slowly, "to file a rent refund request with his imaginary landlord." There was a beat of silence, and then Clara absolutely lost it. She laughed so hard she started crying. One of those full-body laughs where you can't breathe and your stomach hurts and you're not even sure what's so funny anymore, but you can't stop. She laughed until she was wheezing, wiping tears from her eyes, and I just stood there grinning like an idiot, pleased with myself for landing the joke so perfectly. When she finally caught her breath, she said, "I love you so much right now." That was perfect. I didn't actually expect Clara to tell Brandon what I'd said. It felt like one of those things you say to make your spouse laugh, but wouldn't actually relay to the person in question. But apparently Clara was done being diplomatic with her brother, because the next time he called to complain about his ruined life, she told him exactly what I'd suggested. According to Clara, there was about 10 seconds of confused silence on the other end before Brandon hung up without another word. He didn't call back for 2 days, which honestly felt like a vacation. By Friday, I'd almost forgotten what it was like to have house guests from hell. I came home from work, Clara and I ordered Thai food. We watched a movie without anyone interrupting to explain their cryptocurrency investment strategy or ask if we wanted to see their TikTok drafts. It was domestic bliss, the kind of ordinary evening that you don't appreciate until it's been disrupted for a month by people who think temporary means indefinite. That's when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers are usually spam these days, but something made me pick up. Hello, I said, expecting a robot to tell me about my car's extended warranty. Instead, I heard Lydia's voice, sounding tired but calm. Hey, big brother. It's Lydia. Do you have a minute? I'll admit, I wasn't expecting that. The last time I'd seen Lydia, she'd been loading suitcases into her car with mascara running down her face, heading to Portland to figure out if her entire marriage was a lie. I put her on speaker so Clara could hear. Seemed only fair since this involved her brother, and said sure, I had a minute. What followed was one of the most enlightening and simultaneously depressing phone conversations I'd had in recent memory. Turns out, discovering that your husband has been lying to you about owning property is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Brandon's deception. After Lydia left, she'd done what any modern woman scorned would do. She'd started digging through financial records, bank statements, and credit card bills. What she found was, in her words, a whole circus of financial irresponsibility that I somehow missed because I believed the show he was putting on. Brandon's financial struggles that had led to them moving in with us? Yeah, those weren't from the job loss. Those were from a gambling problem that Lydia had no idea about. Online sports betting, fantasy football leagues that required money to enter, poker apps. Brandon had been hemorrhaging cash on gambling for at least a year. I found subscriptions to like 7 different betting sites, Lydia said, her voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. 7. How did I not notice 7 monthly charges for gambling? But wait, there was more, because of course there was. Brandon had also developed an interesting hobby of collecting limited edition sneakers. Not regular sneakers, mind you, but the kind that drop once and then resell for ridiculous amounts on the secondary market. Except Brandon wasn't reselling them. He was just buying them and letting them sit in boxes, convinced they were investments that would pay off eventually. He spent $1,200 on a pair of shoes he never wore, Lydia said. $1,200. And he has like 15 pairs of these things in storage somewhere. I looked at Clara, whose mouth was hanging open in disbelief. This was her brother, the guy who'd been bumming food and housing off us, who'd been giving me financial advice about canceling my gym membership to save money. This dude had been spending thousands on gambling and sneakers while living rent-free and eating my groceries. The audacity was actually impressive in a horrible, can't-look-away kind of way. I just wanted to call and thank you, Lydia continued, her voice softening. I know the way everything came out was messy and embarrassing, but honestly, you did me a favor. If this hadn't blown up when it did, I might have kept believing his lies for years. I might have had kids with him, bought a house with him. Well, thought I was buying a house with him, and ended up completely financially ruined. She paused, and I could hear her take a breath. So thank you for telling me the truth, even though it sucked to hear it. You probably saved me from a much worse disaster down the road. We talked for a few more minutes. Lydia told us she'd filed for separation and was staying with her sister indefinitely. She'd gotten a job at a marketing firm in Portland and was working on rebuilding her credit, which Brandon had apparently damaged pretty significantly. She sounded tired but determined, like someone who'd survived something traumatic and was now focused on healing. Before she hung up, she said one more thing that stuck with me. Next time someone seems too good to be true, I'm asking for receipts. Actual, verifiable receipts. After we hung up, Clara and I sat in silence for a minute, processing everything we'd just learned. Finally, Clara said, "My brother has a gambling problem and a sneaker addiction." I nodded, and he was giving me financial advice. Clara started laughing again, that same slightly hysterical laughter from earlier in the week. Oh my God, he was giving you financial advice while secretly betting on football games and buying $1,000 shoes. That's actually insane. Honestly, that phone call felt better than therapy. Not just because it confirmed that kicking Brandon out had been the right decision, but because it showed that Lydia was going to be okay. She'd gotten out, she was rebuilding, and she'd learned a valuable lesson about red flags and financial transparency. And me? I'd learned that sometimes being the bad guy who tells the truth is actually being the good guy, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. Now, months later, the whole Brandon saga has become our go-to dinner party story. People love it, the fake documents, the rent scheme, the sneaker collection. It's comedy gold, especially the part where I told him his dignity was under the couch. Clara and I turned the spare room into a proper home gym. Every time I walk past it, I smile, remembering that I'm paying zero rent to use my own house. Revolutionary concept, I know. The experience taught me two crucial lessons. Never mix generosity with relatives who think temporary is a lifestyle, and always, put your name alone on the property deed. Also, maybe the Wi-Fi password, though that's more about principle than practicality. Brandon eventually found a job and an apartment, according to Clara's mom. We're cordial at family gatherings, though he avoids eye contact and I avoid mentioning real estate. It works. Now, when someone tells me I'm too kind, I just laugh and say, nah, I'm just a man with a mortgage and trauma. Clara always adds, and trust issues about yogurt. Fair enough.